November 19, 1883, Northern Montana Territory. The snow came in slow and deliberate, a fine ash that settled across the valley like the last breath of something enormous and patient, while the pines leaned under the weight and exhaled cold in a language only the mountains understood. And beneath the canopy, where light had to beg permission to reach earth, 27 men drove stakes into ground that had never asked for names or fires, or the scratching of axes against bark that remembered older laws. The air tasted of pitch and iron, and the far-off char of a forest that had burned 2 summers back, and the cold was not yet cruel, but promised cruelty, the way a dog's low growl promises teeth. And the men moved with the efficiency of those who believe preparation can bargain with wilderness, which it cannot. Before moving forward, hit that subscribe button for the Dark Chronicle. Drop a comment telling where in the world this story is reaching, and let us know what time the clock reads right now. The expedition had been assembled in Mill Creek, a settlement that called itself a town the way a scar calls itself decoration, consisting of Wilson's General Store with its log and plank optimism, 2 saloons that smelled of tobacco and regret, a sawmill whose blades screamed through timber dawn to dusk, and a scattering of structures where men slept between ambitions. Mill Creek sat in a valley ringed by mountains that wore their snow like warnings, and the people who wintered there were the sort who measured wealth in pelts and powder, in how many seasons a man could endure before the land reminded him he was only visiting. It was here, in late October, that Jeremiah Holcomb, a man whose face looked like it had been carved with a dull blade and left unfinished, posted notice in Wilson's store for an expedition into the northern woods, 3 months' work, equal shares of profit, experience mandatory, cowards need not inquire. The men who answered were the sort the frontier breeds and then forgets. Trappers with hands scarred from steel jaws and frozen rivers, hunters whose eyes had learned to read tracks in snow the way preachers read scripture, camp tenders who could make a fire in rain and a meal from almost nothing, and a few young ones hungry enough to mistake hardship for glory. 26 were chosen from a pool of 43 who came through the door with their hats in hand and their pride in their throats. And Holcomb interviewed each with questions that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with whether a man could be silent when silence mattered, and whether his hands shook when he lied. The oldest was 48, a trapper named Gideon Marsh whose limp came from a grizzly and whose quietness came from having survived it. The youngest was 22, a sawmill hand called Thomas Farrow, who had never spent a night beyond shouting distance of a roof and wanted badly to prove he belonged to a harder world. They departed Mill Creek on November 3rd with 19 horses, mules loaded until their spines bowed, and a confidence that looked solid until examined closely, at which point it revealed itself as the thin ice over deep water that it was. The journey north took 11 days through country that had not decided whether to allow passage or to swallow them quietly, following trails that were barely suggestions, crossing the Clark Fork River, where the water ran so cold it seemed to have opinions about flesh, and then veering northwest into forests where the trees grew close enough to make a man feel watched and tall enough to make him feel small. The land rose and buckled, ridges appeared like the knuckles of a buried fist, and the valleys between them were filled with a silence that had texture and weight, the kind of silence that makes a man speak in whispers without knowing why. On November 14th, they reached the place Holcomb had chosen from a survey map that turned out to be more hopeful than accurate, a clearing near a creek the locals called Blackwater, for the way its stones were stained or for the way it ran after heavy rain, depending on who was asked and how much they had drunk before answering. The creek bent around the site like a question mark, the water cold and clear and muttering over stones that had been smoothed by a patience men do not possess. And the trees on the far bank stood so thick that a man could vanish into them after 3 steps and not be found until spring, if at all. The clearing itself was a half-moon of open ground bordered by pine and spruce, a few scattered boulders that looked like they had been dropped by something annoyed, and a soil that was rocky enough to make digging a negotiation, but dry enough to hold a foundation if a man was stubborn. The first week was labor without reward, the kind that makes backs scream and hands bleed, felling timber and dragging it into rough stacks, clearing ground until the axes rang like bells and the saws sang their jagged hymns, and the men worked in shifts, some with tools and some with rifles because the woods had eyes even if the men could not see them. Holcomb directed the layout with a surveyor's precision, sketching the camp in his journal as if ink could make it true. 7 cabins arranged in a rough circle like wagons braced for attack, a larger central structure that would serve as mess hall and meeting place, and a perimeter marked by sharpened stakes driven into the ground at angles, not to repel men but to give predators pause and to keep the horses from testing their luck in the dark. By November 21st, the first cabin was roofed, and the men took turns sleeping inside as if it were a prize, though the walls were still gaps and the cold came through like a tenant who did not pay rent. The weather held with an eerie politeness, snow falling in whispers rather than shouts, temperatures cold enough to remind but not to punish, and the men noted this in the way men note a stranger's smile, grateful but uncertain why it is being offered. Holcomb's journal from these days is meticulous to the point of tedium. November 22nd, completed second cabin, roof needs sealing. November 23rd, stakes set on eastern perimeter, Pharaoh cut his hand on a splinter, wrapped and working. November 24th, hunting party returned with 2 elk, spirits high, weather holds. The tone is that of a man who believes the world operates by rules, and that following them ensures safety, which is the tone of a man who has not yet learned otherwise. By December 1st, the camp was nearly complete, and the men celebrated with a ration of whiskey that Holcomb had kept hidden until morale required it, and they drank standing around a fire that pushed back the dark in a circle that felt smaller than it should have, and someone played a mouth harp badly, and someone else told a story about a wolverine that could not possibly be true. And the laughter that followed was louder than the joke deserved, because laughter is what men use to fill spaces fear wants to occupy. The cabins stood like crooked teeth, the mess hall squatted in the center with a chimney that smoked more than it drafted, and the perimeter stakes cast shadows that moved when the firelight moved, making the clearing feel less like a camp and more like a stage. That night, after the whiskey was gone and the men had stumbled to their bunks, Gideon Marsh stood outside his cabin and stared into the trees with the stillness of a man listening to a language he used to know. And when Thomas Pharaoh, too young and too eager, asked what he was looking at, Marsh said nothing for a long time and then, without turning, said, "The woods here did not sound right, that there were no owls and no wolves, and that when a forest goes quiet, it is either because something big is moving or because something big is waiting." Pharaoh laughed the way young men laugh at fear they do not yet respect, and Marsh did not laugh back, and the silence between them was the kind that builds walls. The trap lines went out in the first week of December, radiating from the camp like the spokes of a broken wheel, each line marked with blazes cut into bark and cairns of stone, so the men could find their way back when the snow deepened and the world became a single white sentence without punctuation. The lines followed the creek, climbed ridges, dropped into hollows where the cold pooled like water, and the men checked them in pairs because a man alone is a man. The forest considers negotiable. The first pelts came in steady. Marten with fur the color of polished wood, fox whose tails could buy a week's wages, beaver thick and oily, and a few lynx whose pelts were rare enough to make Holcomb smile in a way that showed his teeth but not his eyes. The men worked with the rhythm of a clock, checking lines at dawn, skinning and stretching hides before noon, setting new traps in the afternoon, and returning to camp before the light failed, which it did early and without apology. But something was wrong in a way that had no name yet, a wrongness that lived in the spaces between the daily routines, in the way the horses shifted and stamped for no reason, in the way the dogs, 3 mutts brought for companionship and alarm, began sleeping in a pile near the fire, instead of wandering the camp as dogs do, and in the way certain traps were found sprung but empty, the bait gone and no tracks in the snow to say what had taken it. Holcomb noted these irregularities in his journal with the irritation of a man whose ledger will not balance. December 7th, trap 16 sprung, bait gone, no sign. December 9th, same on trap 23, will reset and monitor. December 11th, dogs refused to follow Haywood to the north line. unusual behavior. The tone shifts here, subtle as a crack in ice, from confidence to something more cautious, and the handwriting previously neat begins to slant. On December 13th, one of the hunting parties, 4 men led by a trapper named Samuel Cord, who had spent 15 winters in these mountains and knew them the way a man knows a scar, returned 3 hours late with 2 deer but without the usual banter, and when asked why they were delayed, Cord said they had found a place up on the north ridge that did not sit right. A clearing within the forest where the snow had not settled evenly, where the trees around the edge were scorched black at the base as if something had breathed on them, and where the silence was so complete that it felt like a held breath. He said they had not stayed long because the horses refused to enter, and when pressed to describe it further, he shook his head and said some places do not want describing and should not be visited twice. The younger men dismissed this as superstition, the kind of talk old trappers use to keep their reputation sharp, but the older men exchanged glances that meant they had heard stories like this before. Stories that start with a place that feels wrong and end with men who do not come back or who come back changed in ways that make others wish they had not. Holcomb, to his credit, did not dismiss it outright, but he also did not let it stop the work. He marked the area in his journal with a note to avoid the North Ridge for trapping purposes and moved on, because a man leading an expedition cannot afford to let fear become policy. That night, the temperature dropped with a suddenness that made the cabin walls creak and the fire struggle, and the men woke to frost inside the windows and breath that hung in the air like small ghosts, and one of the dogs, a brindled mutt named Rust, began howling at something outside the perimeter, a howl that started low and climbed until it broke into a yelp, and then stopped as if a hand had been placed over its mouth. The men grabbed rifles and lanterns and stumbled into the cold, their breath trailing behind them, and they found Rust standing at the edge of the stakes, stiff-legged and trembling, staring into the trees where the lantern light did not reach, and when they called him back, he did not move until Holcomb himself walked out and dragged him by the scruff. And even then the dog kept his eyes on the forest as if something there had promised to return. They found no tracks, no prints, no disturbance in the snow, and the men stood in a loose circle with their rifles ready and their nerves tighter, scanning the darkness for a shape or a sound that would give them something to aim at. But the forest gave them nothing except the slow creak of branches and the occasional thump of snow sliding from a bough. After 20 minutes, Holcomb ordered them back inside, posted a double watch, and told them to wake him if anything else happened, and the men obeyed but did not sleep, and the watch rotation was the longest of the expedition so far, each man staring into the dark and seeing shapes that were not there, or worse, shapes that might be. The journal entry for December 14th is brief. Dog disturbed in night, no cause found, men uneasy but working. The handwriting is tighter, as if Holcomb's hand had forgotten how to relax. The days bled into each other with the monotony of winter work, and the pelts continued to accumulate, stacked and bundled in the storage cabin where the cold kept them from rot, and the count rose toward a number that would make the expedition profitable if they could hold through to spring, which was the thought every man carried but did not say aloud, because saying it felt like tempting something. The trap lines stretched farther as the nearby areas were exhausted, and the men began ranging a full day's walk from camp, marking their paths with blazes and cairns, and the silent prayer that they would remember the way back. On December 18th, 2 men did not return by dark. Their names were Eli Hackett and Morgan Webb, both experienced trappers, both steady and neither prone to panic or foolishness, and when the sun set and they had not appeared, Holcomb organized a search party of 6 men with torches and rifles, and they followed the northern trap line into a forest that seemed darker than night had any right to make it, calling names that the trees swallowed without echo. They found the line intact, the traps checked and reset, the blazes clear and no sign of struggle or deviation, and then 3 miles from camp they found Webb's rifle leaning against a tree, as if he had set it down gently and intended to pick it up again, and beside it his pack, still buckled, contents untouched. There were no tracks leading away, no blood, no torn fabric, no indication that anything had happened except that a man had stopped existing mid-task. The search party stood in a circle around the rifle and the pack, their torches casting wild shadows, and no one spoke because there was nothing to say that would not make the silence worse. They continued searching until the cold became dangerous, then returned to camp and tried again at first light, scouring the area in widening circles, calling names until their throats were raw, and finding nothing. Hackett's gear was discovered a quarter-mile from Webb's, similarly arranged, similarly abandoned, and the men who found it backed away from it as if it were cursed. Holcomb's journal entry for December 19th is the first to show real fear. Webb and Hackett missing, gear found, no sign of struggle or departure, no tracks, no blood, nothing. This makes no sense. Men do not simply vanish. We'll continue search tomorrow, but am at a loss. The word nothing is underlined 3 times. The camp became a different place after that, the routines continuing but the ease gone, replaced by a tension that made men jump at sounds that were not there and avoid the forest's gaze when they worked. The trap lines were shortened, no man was allowed out alone, and the watches were tripled, 3 men at a time circling the perimeter with rifles loaded and eyes that ached from staring into darkness. The dogs stayed near the fire and whined when the wind changed, and the horses became skittish, rolling their eyes and pulling at their tethers. And one night a mule kicked through the side of its pen and had to be restrained by 4 men while it screamed in a way mules do not usually scream. On December 22nd, it happened again. This time it was 3 men, Pierce, Donovan, and a young trapper named Kyle Emery, who had been joking that morning about how his mother would faint if she saw him now, bearded and filthy and rich with pelts. They went out to check the southern line and did not return. The search party found their packs and rifles arranged in a neat row, like soldiers at attention, and beside them their knives still sheathed and their hatchets blades clean. No bodies, no tracks, no struggle. It was as if they had been lifted from the earth by something that did not leave marks. Holcomb's entry that night breaks. 5 men gone. No bodies, no sense. I do not know what is happening. Men are terrified. Some want to leave. I have convinced them to wait until morning. The handwriting is unraveling. But morning came and brought no answers, only a new fear that sat in the camp like a cold fog. And when Holcomb suggested they abandon the expedition and head back to Mill Creek, 8 men agreed immediately, but 10 others said the snow was too deep now. The pass is likely closed, and leaving would mean dying on the trail instead of in camp, which was choosing the manner of death rather than avoiding it. The argument lasted hours, voices rising, and in the end, Holcomb made the decision to stay put, fortify, and wait for the snow to ease. And the men accepted this because they had no better plan, and because sometimes men obey, not because they trust the leader, but because they are too afraid to lead themselves. The journal entries after Christmas, if Holcomb celebrated, he did not note it, become erratic, the handwriting slanting further, entire sentences scratched out, dates sometimes skipped. December 27th, another man missing, found his coat at the north perimeter. Coat was warm. He had been wearing it moments before. No one saw him go. December 29th. Dogs are gone. All 3 vanished from beside the fire while men were eating. No one heard anything. This is not natural. January 2nd. 14 men left. We have barricaded inside the mess hall. No one goes out alone. Rifle always in hand. Something is in the woods. Marsh says he saw it at dusk. Tall and wrong. I did not see it, but I believe him because I feel it watching. The final entry in Holcomb's journal is dated January 9th, 1884, and it is a single line, written in a hand that shakes so badly the letters are barely legible. We are 9 now, and we are leaving at first light. May God forgive us for what we are leaving behind. January 10th, 1884, Northern Montana Territory. The dawn that broke over Blackwater Creek Camp was not a kindness but an exposure, a pale gray light that revealed what the night had hidden. The mess hall door hanging open despite being barricaded from inside. The perimeter stakes toppled in a section facing east as if something had leaned against them with patient weight, and footprints in the fresh snow that led from the cabins toward the forest, but did not lead back. And these prints were wrong in a way that made the 9 remaining men stare without speaking, because the prints were human in shape, but wrong in depth. Too shallow for a man carrying his weight. Too evenly spaced for a man moving in fear. The temperature had climbed during the night, unusual for January in the high country, and the snow had softened to a wet heaviness that clung to boots and made walking feel like an argument with the earth. And the air smelled of pine and something else, something metallic and old, like blood left too long in cold water. The 9 men stood in a loose cluster near the remains of the fire, their rifles held across their chests, their eyes moving between each other in the forest with the jerky caution of prey animals who have learned that stillness is not the same as safety. Jeremiah Holcomb looked a decade older than he had 2 months prior, his face gray and drawn, his hands shaking when he lifted them to gesture, and his voice when he spoke was hoarse from shouting orders that no longer mattered, because the thing they were facing did not respond to human authority or human logic. He told the men they would pack only essentials, leave the pelts, leave the tools, leave everything that would slow them down, and they would move south toward Mill Creek at first light, following the creek bed because it was the only landmark they could trust when the forest tried to confuse them, which it would. Gideon Marsh, the oldest of the survivors, stood apart from the group with his rifle resting on his shoulder and his eyes scanning the tree line with the methodical patience of a man who had spent his life reading Wilderness for lies. And when Holcomb asked him if he thought they could make it, Marsh did not answer immediately, and when he did answer, he said the forest would let them go or it would not. And preparation was a prayer men said to comfort themselves, but which changed nothing about what waited in the trees. The younger men did not like this answer, but they did not argue with it either, because Marsh had a way of speaking that made disagreement feel like vanity. Thomas Farrow, the youngest, had stopped trying to prove he belonged, and now only tried to stay close to the fire and avoid looking at the cabins where men he had known were no longer sleeping. And his hands had developed a tremor that he hid by keeping them in his pockets, and his eyes had the glassy look of someone who has stopped expecting tomorrow to arrive. The other 6 were trappers and hunters whose names had stopped mattering because names imply individuality, and individuality requires a future, and these men had begun to see themselves as a single organism with 9 parts moving together because separation meant vanishing, and vanishing had become the only certainty. They spent the morning gathering what could be carried: dried meat, hardtack, ammunition, blankets, rope, and the few medical supplies that remained after 2 months of minor injuries and major fear. The pelts, hundreds of them, bundled and stacked in the storage cabin, were left behind, a fortune in fur that represented months of labor, and which now represented nothing because wealth requires living men to spend it. Holcomb stood in the doorway of the storage cabin and stared at the pelts for a long time, his jaw working as if chewing words he could not swallow, and then he turned and walked away without closing the door, which felt like the final acknowledgement that the expedition was not paused but finished. By noon, the 9 men stood at the southern edge of the camp with their packs strapped tight and their rifles loaded, and they looked back at the cabins and the mess hall and the overturned perimeter stakes. And the camp looked small and sad, a child's attempt to impose order on a landscape that had never agreed to be tamed. The sky had lowered during the morning, a ceiling of gray that promised snow, and the wind had picked up, not strong but persistent, carrying a cold that found the gaps in clothing and reminded skin that it was only a thin barrier between warmth and nothing. They moved in single file, Holcomb leading because he was still the leader in name if not in confidence, Marsh at the rear because he was the one most likely to sense if something followed, and the others sandwiched between, their eyes darting to the trees on either side, their boots crunching in snow that seemed louder than it should be, as if the forest were listening to their progress and measuring it against something. The creek ran to their right, dark water sliding over stones with a sound that was almost soothing, if not for the fact that every other sound had stopped. No birds, no wind in the high branches, no small skitterings of creatures going about their business, just the crunch of boots and the murmur of water and the occasional ragged breath of a man trying not to panic. They had walked less than a mile when they found the first marker, a cairn of stones they had built on the journey north, and it had been disturbed. The stones scattered in a circle as if something had sat on top of the cairn and kicked them away with lazy sweeps. And in the center of the circle was a pattern drawn in the snow, lines and curves that suggested intent, but not meaning. And the men stood staring at it until Holcomb said to keep moving, and they obeyed. But every man looked back at the pattern as they walked away, trying to memorize it or trying to forget it, and none of them could have said which. The snow began falling an hour later, not the gentle whisper of the past weeks, but a thick curtain that cut visibility to 20 feet, and made the world a small room with white walls that pressed closer every moment. Holcomb called a halt and told the men to stay together, to keep the creek in earshot, to not wander even a few feet from the line, because in snow like this, a man could turn around and lose the group in seconds. They moved slower, testing each step, their faces turned down to avoid the snow that tried to blind them. And the forest on either side became suggestions of darkness within white trunks and branches that appeared and disappeared like thoughts half remembered. When the snow eased an hour before dusk, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, a pitiful distance, and Holcomb made the decision to stop for the night rather than risk walking in darkness through terrain they could not see. They found a cluster of boulders that offered some windbreak and built a fire in the shelter of the stones, using deadfall they gathered from the immediate area, because no one wanted to walk into the trees to find better wood. The fire struggled in the damp, smoking more than burning, but it gave light and a small measure of heat, and the men sat around it in a tight circle, their backs to the forest, their rifles across their laps. No one suggested posting a watch because no one believed a watch would matter, and no one suggested sleeping because no one believed they would sleep, and so they sat in silence, staring at flames that wavered and dimmed and occasionally flared when a pocket of sap caught, and the darkness beyond the firelight was absolute, the kind of darkness that feels solid, that feels like it has texture and weight and intention. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained low and featureless. No stars, no moon, just a vast black ceiling that made the world feel small and temporary. It was Thomas Farrow who broke the silence, his voice quiet and shaking, saying he had seen something moving at the edge of the firelight, a shape that was tall and thin and moved wrong, not with the gait of a man or the lope of an animal, but with a stuttering glide, as if it were skipping frames in a motion picture that had not yet been invented. The other men turned to look where he pointed, and they saw nothing, just trees and snow and darkness. But they did not tell him he was wrong, because several of them had seen it too, or thought they had, a flicker of movement that the eye caught but the mind refused to process. Marsh said without turning his head that it had been following them since they left camp, staying just beyond sight, pacing them, and he said this in the flat tone of a man reporting weather. No fear, no surprise, just fact. Holcomb asked why he had not said anything earlier, and Marsh said there was no point because knowing it was there did not change the fact that they could not outrun it, or fight it, or understand it. And saying it out loud would only make the younger men panic, which was happening now anyway. So the silence had been a kindness that had expired. The fire burned lower, and no one added wood because no one wanted to walk even 5 feet to gather more. And as the light diminished, the sense of something waiting beyond it grew stronger, a presence that was not seen but felt, the way a man feels eyes on his back in an empty room. One of the trappers, a man named Sutton who had barely spoken since December, began to pray in a whisper, the words running together into a stream of sound that was less about faith and more about filling the silence with something human. And no one told him to stop because the sound was a small comfort, a reminder that they were still men, and not just meat waiting to be claimed. The night stretched with the cruel slowness of a nightmare that refuses to end. Seconds dripping like cold water, and the men sat and shivered and watched the fire die to embers and then to a faint glow that barely pushed back the dark. Twice, something large moved in the forest, branches snapping under weight, and the sound circled the camp slowly, deliberately, as if whatever made it wanted them to know it was there. Rifles were raised, hammers cocked, but there was nothing to shoot at, just sound and darkness, and the terrible certainty that they were being observed by something that did not need light to see. Dawn came with the reluctance of a man approaching a gallows, the sky lightening to gray by degrees, so slow that for a long time the men could not tell if it was actually getting brighter or if their eyes were simply adjusting to despair. When there was finally enough light to see, they stood on legs that had gone stiff from cold and fear, and they looked at each other with faces that were pale and drawn. And they did not speak because there was nothing to say that would not acknowledge how close they had come to breaking. They walked. The creek guided them south, and the snow underfoot was crusty and treacherous, breaking through to soft powder beneath, and every step was a negotiation between balance and falling. The forest closed in on both sides, the trees leaning over the creek as if trying to block the route. And the silence was so complete that the men could hear their own heartbeats, a drum chorus of fear keeping time. By midday, they reached a place where the creek split, one branch continuing south, the other veering east. And there was no marker to indicate which was the correct path because the markers had been set on the journey north when they had followed game trails, not waterways. Holcomb took out his compass, hands shaking, and tried to orient. But the needle spun lazily and would not settle, turning in slow circles as if the Earth's magnetism had been replaced by something else. He tapped the compass, shook it, held it level, but the needle continued its lazy spin. And the men watched this with a creeping horror because a compass that does not point is a compass that admits the rules no longer apply. Marsh stepped forward and studied both branches, reading the land the way some men read books. And after a long pause, he pointed to the southern branch and said it looked deeper and faster, which meant it was the main channel, and the group followed his judgment because they had no better option. They walked for another hour, and the creek began to narrow, the banks closing in, the water moving faster, and then the banks became walls, rock rising on either side, and the men found themselves walking through a ravine that had not been there on the journey north, or which they had somehow avoided, or which had grown in the weeks since. The ravine deepened as they walked, the walls rising to 15 feet, then 20, then 30, and the strip of sky above became a narrow ribbon of gray, and the light was dim and cold, and the sound of their boots echoed off the stone in strange ways, doubling and tripling, so that it sounded like many more than 9 men were walking. Holcomb called a halt and said they needed to turn back, that the ravine was wrong. But when they turned, the path behind them looked different than it had moments before. The walls closer together, the turns sharper, and there was a brief moment when no one moved because they were all realizing the same thing. The forest was not letting them leave. They continued forward because backward no longer made sense, and the ravine twisted and narrowed, and at one point, they had to walk single file with their packs scraping the stone walls, and the sky above was now just a thin crack, and the air was colder here, and damp, and smelled of minerals and something rotten. The ravine opened suddenly into a small circular space, perhaps 30 feet across, with walls that rose sheer on all sides, and no visible exit, except the way they had come. In the center of the space was a structure, if it could be called that, a framework of branches and bones lashed together with sinew or rope or something that glistened wetly in the dim light. And the structure was taller than a man and vaguely pyramidal, and hanging from it were objects. Pieces of cloth, a knife, a boot, a hat, and other things that might once have belonged to men. The 9 stood at the entrance to the space and stared, and no one moved forward because instinct said that stepping into that circle was stepping into a trap, and Holcomb's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, saying they needed to go back now, immediately, and the men turned as one and walked quickly back the way they had come, and the ravine seemed shorter on the return, the walls wider, and within 10 minutes, they were back at the place where the creek split, as if the ravine had ejected them, and they stood gasping and shaking, and no one spoke of what they had seen because speaking it would make it more real. They took the eastern branch this time, moving fast, almost running, driven by a fear that had gone beyond panic into a kind of desperate focus, and the branch led them through forest that was thicker and darker, and the snow here was deeper, and their progress slowed. And by the time the light began to fail again, they had no idea how far they had come or where they were. They stopped in a clearing that was too open to be comfortable but too exhausted to continue, and they built no fire because they had no energy and no faith that fire would help. And they huddled together in the dark, sharing body heat, rifles held ready, waiting for dawn or for whatever would come first. The night was worse than the previous one. Sounds moved around the clearing, footsteps that crunched in snow, heavy and deliberate. And at one point, something breathed just beyond the circle of men. A wet, rasping sound that went on for a full minute and then stopped. One of the trappers, a man named Keller, began to sob quietly, and another, named Reese, told him to shut up. And Keller did not shut up, and Reese hit him, a dull thud in the darkness, and Holcomb had to pull them apart, hissing at both to be silent, and the group settled into a tense quiet broken only by ragged breathing and the occasional whimper that no one acknowledged. When dawn came, there were only 8 men in the clearing. Keller was gone. His rifle lay in the snow where he had been sitting, his pack beside it, but Keller himself had vanished without sound, without struggle, plucked from the middle of the group while they sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark. The men stared at the empty space and no one said anything because there was nothing to say. And Holcomb picked up Keller's rifle and handed it to Pharaoh, whose own had jammed the day before, and they walked. The forest changed as they moved, the trees becoming denser, the undergrowth thicker, and at times, they had to hack through brambles that seemed to grow overnight, thorns catching at clothing and skin, and the progress was measured in feet rather than miles. The compass remained useless, the needle spinning or pointing at nothing consistent, and the sun, when it appeared through the overcast, seemed to be in the wrong part of the sky, too far north or too far west, and time itself felt slippery. Hours passing like minutes or minutes stretching into hours, and the men stopped trusting their senses and simply followed Holcomb because someone had to lead, even if leading meant nothing. On the 3rd day after leaving camp, or what they thought was the 3rd day, they stumbled onto a road. It was narrow and overgrown, barely more than a track, but it was unmistakably a road, cut by men, used by wagons, and the sight of it brought tears to Pharaoh's eyes and a low moan of relief from Sutton. They followed the road south, walking faster now, hope rekindling like embers that had been doused but not extinguished, and the forest began to thin, the trees spacing out, and the sky opened above them, and for the first time in days, the sun felt warm. The road led them to a structure, a cabin, abandoned but intact, and they approached it cautiously, rifles ready, and found it empty, the door hanging open, the inside thick with dust and the smell of old wood. They searched it quickly and found nothing useful, no food, no supplies. But the walls were solid and the roof held, and Holcomb made the decision to rest here for the night, to sleep under a roof, to have 4 walls between them and the forest. The men agreed, and they barricaded the door and the single window, and they sat on the floor with their backs to the walls, and for the first time in days, some of them slept. Marsh did not sleep. He sat by the window, peering through a crack in the boards, watching the forest. And when Holcomb asked him what he was looking for, Marsh said he was looking for the thing that had followed them, because it was still out there. He could feel it, and it was waiting for them to lower their guard. Holcomb asked if he thought they were safe in the cabin, and Marsh said no, nowhere was safe. But walls were better than open ground, and hope was a thing the mind needed even when the body knew better. When they left the cabin at dawn, there were 7. Reese had been sleeping near the door, and when they woke, he was gone, the barricade undisturbed, no sound, no sign, just an empty space where a man had been. The remaining men did not discuss it, did not speculate. They simply picked up their packs and walked, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. The road continued south, and the forest fell away entirely, replaced by open country, rolling hills covered in snow, and in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the first sign of civilization they had seen in weeks. The men began to run, a stumbling, exhausted run, driven by the sight of that smoke, and they ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, and they collapsed in the snow within sight of the town, and they laughed and cried and thanked God or luck or whatever had allowed them to survive. But when they stood and turned to look back at the forest, it was gone. Where there should have been trees and darkness and the ravine and the camp, there was only open land, snow-covered and empty, as if the forest had never been there at all. The 7 men stared, and no one spoke, because they knew no one would believe them, and perhaps they did not believe themselves. January 15th, 1884, Mill Creek, Montana Territory. The 7 men who stumbled into town looked less like survivors and more like revenants dragged from a grave too shallow to hold them, their faces hollowed by hunger and something deeper than hunger, their eyes carrying a blankness that made townsfolk step back without knowing why, and their clothes hung on frames that had lost too much weight too quickly, as if the forest had taken flesh as payment for passage. They arrived in the early afternoon when the sun was high but gave no warmth, their boots worn through at the heels, their hands wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been shirt sleeves, and when they reached the center of town and saw Wilson's General Store with its familiar false front and the saloon with its painted sign, Thomas Farrow dropped to his knees in the snow and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughter, but something in between that made children hide behind their mothers' skirts. The town physician, a man named Dr. Amos Caldwell, who had seen his share of frostbite and bullet wounds and the various ways the frontier broke men, examined them in the back room of his practice and found them physically intact but suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and what he wrote in his notes as acute nervous exhaustion of unknown origin. Their feet were blistered and blackened in places, their hands showed signs of severe cold injury, and several had lost toenails or fingernails, but these were injuries that would heal with time and care. What would not heal, the doctor noted with growing unease, was whatever had happened to their minds, because when he asked them to describe the expedition, they either stared at him in silence or began to speak, and then stopped mid-sentence as if the words had been taken from their mouths by an invisible hand. Jeremiah Holcomb, who had led the expedition with the confidence of a man who believed in maps and planning, sat in a chair by the doctor's stove and refused to remove his coat even though the room was warm enough to make sweat bead on foreheads. And when asked why 20 men were missing, he said they were gone. And when asked how they were gone, he said the forest took them. And when pressed for details, his hands began to shake so violently that the doctor stopped asking, and instead gave him a tonic laced with laudanum and told him to rest. Holcomb did not rest. He sat in that chair for 3 hours, staring at the wall, his lips moving soundlessly, his eyes tracking things that were not in the room. And when night fell, he stood abruptly and walked out into the cold without his coat, and had to be retrieved by 2 men who found him standing in the middle of the street staring north toward the mountains, with his arms at his sides and frost forming in his beard. Gideon Marsh, the eldest of the survivors, was the only one who spoke with any coherence, and what he said was worse than silence. He told the doctor that the camp at Blackwater Creek had been built in a place that did not want them, that the forest there was old in a way that had nothing to do with the age of trees, and that something lived in those woods that was neither animal nor spirit, but a presence that existed in the spaces where sight fails and reason offers no comfort. He said the men had not been killed, but taken, pulled from the world one by one, as if erased by a hand reaching through a veil. And he said the survivors had not escaped, but been released, spat out by the forest the way a mouth spits out something bitter. He said all of this in a flat monotone while staring at his hands, and when the doctor asked if he believed what he was saying, Marsh looked up with eyes that had gone colorless and said, belief was irrelevant because the forest cared nothing for what men believed or did not believe. The town's response was predictable in its inadequacy. A meeting was called at the town hall, a drafty structure that served as church on Sundays and court on Wednesdays, and the leading men of Mill Creek gathered to hear testimony and decide on a course of action. Holcomb was brought in to speak but could not, his voice failing after the first sentence, his body beginning to tremble, and he was escorted out and given more laudanum and told to rest. Marsh spoke instead, delivering his account in the same flat tone, describing the missing men by name, recounting the strange occurrences at camp, the abandoned gear, the ravine that should not have existed, and the structure of bones they had found in the circular space. The men in the hall listened with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disbelief, and when Marsh finished, there was a long silence before the questions began. Had there been signs of Indian activity? No. Had the men been drinking or using substances that might cause hallucinations? No. Had there been a disease, something in the water or the meat that could explain erratic behavior? No. Had any of the survivors seen what took the men? No. Then how could they be certain the men were taken and not simply lost or frozen or victims of their own poor decisions? Marsh had no answer that would satisfy men who needed the world to make sense, and so he said nothing, and the silence that followed was the sound of a town deciding that some truths are too uncomfortable to accept, and therefore must be reclassified as lies or madness. A search party was organized despite the objections of those who said winter made such a mission suicidal. 12 men volunteered, led by a tracker named Hugh Corrigan, who had spent 2 decades in the mountains and who believed that missing men meant bodies waiting to be found, and that bodies meant closure, and closure meant the town could return to its business without ghosts. They left Mill Creek on January 20th with provisions for 2 weeks, sleds pulled by dogs, rifles, and sidearms, and a confidence born of inexperience with the kind of absence Marsh had described. They followed the route the expedition had taken, using Holcomb's journal, which had been recovered from his pack and which the town clerk had read aloud at the meeting, its final entries causing murmurs of unease, but not enough to stop the search. The search party returned on February 3rd, 9 days ahead of schedule, with 2 men missing and the others refusing to speak of what had happened, except to say they had found the camp at Blackwater Creek and wished they had not. Corrigan, whose confidence had been replaced by something that looked like shell shock, gave a brief report to the town council that was later transcribed and filed in the territorial records. The camp had been intact, he said, the cabin standing, the mess hall's door still hanging open as described. But the entire site was wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. The snow inside the cabins was undisturbed, as if nothing had walked there in weeks, but the walls showed marks, deep gouges in the wood that went from floor to ceiling in parallel lines, 4 at a time, as if something with claws had dragged them slowly down while standing inside. The perimeter stakes were all toppled, not blown over but pressed flat into the ground as if stepped on by something immense. The storage cabin where the pelts had been left was empty, not ransacked but empty, the furs gone without a strand of hair or a scrap of leather left behind, the floor swept clean. The 2 men who went missing from the search party had vanished on the second night at the camp, taken from inside the mess hall where the group had barricaded themselves, and Corrigan's voice broke when he described waking to find them gone. The barricade still in place, no sound, no struggle, just absence. He said they had searched the area for a day and then decided to leave, and on the way out, they had found markers along the trail that had not been there on the way in, small stacks of stones topped with objects, a tooth, a button, a scrap of cloth with initials stitched in thread. He said the markers felt like warnings or trophies or both, and when asked if he would return to search further, he said no man could pay him enough to go back to that place, and the way he said it made the council decide that no further expeditions would be authorized. The story spread through the territory with the speed of fire and dry grass, carried by trappers and traders, and the kind of men who deal in rumors because rumors are currency in places where news travels slowly. The details changed with each telling, growing more elaborate or more sparse depending on the teller, but the core remained the same. 20 men had entered the forest and not returned, and the place where they vanished was a wound in the landscape that would not heal. Some said it was Indians, a revenge killing for some forgotten slight, but the tribes in the area denied knowledge and pointed out that they avoided Blackwater Creek for reasons their elders would not explain. Some said it was a grizzly, a rogue animal of unusual size and cunning, but grizzlies do not arrange gear in neat rows or build structures of bone or take men from barricaded rooms without leaving tracks. Some said it was madness, a shared delusion brought on by isolation and cold. But madness does not make men vanish. It only makes them wish they could. The 7 survivors did not stay in Mill Creek. Holcomb left first, departing by stage in early February without saying goodbye to anyone, his destination unknown, his belongings left behind in the boarding house where he had stayed. He was later reported seen in Denver, then Kansas City, then nowhere, and inquiries sent to family in Ohio were returned unopened. Marsh stayed through February, recovering his strength, and then departed on foot with a pack and a rifle, heading south. And when asked where he was going, he said away, and when asked if he would trap again, he shook his head and walked without looking back. Thomas Farrow stayed the longest, lingering through March, working odd jobs at the sawmill, living in a back room of the saloon and drinking more than he worked. He spoke rarely and slept poorly, and the few times he tried to describe what had happened, the words came out jumbled and frantic, and people learned to change the subject or walk away. In late March, he left Mill Creek on a freight wagon heading east, and a letter arrived 6 months later from his mother in Pennsylvania, saying he had returned home but was much changed, refusing to speak of Montana and spending his days sitting by the window watching the trees in a way that made her worry he was watching for something. The other 4 survivors scattered to destinations that were not recorded, their names fading from memory as the town moved on to other concerns, other tragedies, other stories that were easier to tell. By summer, the expedition to Blackwater Creek had become a cautionary tale told in saloons and around campfires. The kind of story men told to prove they knew the wilderness was dangerous and that respect must be paid, though what was being respected was never clearly defined. The number of missing changed depending on who was telling it. Some said 18, others said 25, and the details blurred into mythology, the structure of bones becoming a totem pole, the ravine becoming a canyon, the presence in the woods becoming a beast, with a name borrowed from tribal legends or invented wholesale. But there were those who did not forget and did not mythologize, who took the story seriously because they had heard similar stories before from other places and other times, stories of forests that take men and do not give them back, of clearings where the rules change and compasses spin and time moves sideways. These were mostly old trappers and hunters who had spent enough years in the wild to know that the wilderness is not neutral and not empty, that there are places where the boundary between the known world and something else grows thin, and that men who build camps in such places are not pioneers, but trespassers. They marked the location of Blackwater Creek on their mental maps as a place to avoid, and they did not share the location with younger men because some knowledge is a burden best left uncarried. In the years that followed, there were occasional reports of trappers who went north toward the area and did not return, though whether they met with ordinary misfortune or something less ordinary was impossible to say. A party of surveyors mapping the region in 1887 noted in their field logs that they had encountered an area of dense forest where their instruments malfunctioned and their horses refused to proceed, and they had marked it on their maps with a notation that read unsuitable for development, cause unknown. A prospector in 1891 claimed to have found the remains of a camp matching the description of Blackwater Creek, but when pressed for details, he became agitated and refused to discuss it further, and the territorial office dismissed his report as unreliable. A trapper in 1896 brought a journal into a trading post in Missoula, saying he had found it in the woods, and the journal matched the handwriting in Holcomb's entries, but the final pages contained writing that was not Holcomb's hand, a scrawl that read, "We are still here," over and over until the pages ran out, and the trapper who found it said he had burned his maps and would never trap north of the Clark Fork again. The town of Mill Creek declined slowly, the sawmill closing in 1889, the saloons emptying as men moved to richer prospects, and by the turn of the century, it was little more than a name on outdated maps. Wilson's General Store burned in 1903, and the town hall collapsed under snow in 1907, and the few families who remained moved away or died, and the cemetery grew quieter. The story of the expedition faded with the town, remembered by fewer and fewer people, until it became one of those footnotes in territorial history that historians encounter and dismiss as apocryphal or exaggerated, the kind of tale that fills the margins of serious scholarship with a whiff of campfire smoke and superstition. But in the north, in the forests that climb the mountains and stretch beyond sight, There is a place where the trees grow denser and the snow falls heavier, and the silence is so complete that even the wind seems to whisper rather than blow. The camp at Blackwater Creek is gone now, reclaimed by the forest. The cabins collapsed and rotted, the perimeter stakes long since vanished, and the clearing grown over with saplings and brush. But the place remains, and those who stumble upon it by accident report a feeling of unease that drives them away, a sense that they are being watched by something that exists just beyond perception, and a certainty that they should not be there. The creek still runs dark and cold, murmuring over stones that have heard things no stone should have to hear, and in winter, when the snow is deep and the days are short, there are patterns in the drifts that suggest footprints leading into the trees. Too many footprints, too varied in size and shape, as if a crowd had walked there and not returned. And on certain nights, when the wind is still and the temperature drops and the moon is hidden behind clouds, there are sounds that carry from that place. Sounds that might be branches rubbing or ice cracking or animals moving. But which sound, instead like voices calling names, the same names over and over, the names of the 20 men who entered the forest in 1883 and never walked out. The voices are faint and distant, and they do not ask for help or offer explanation. They simply call, as if trying to remember who they were before the forest took that knowledge away and replaced it with something else. The 7 survivors, wherever they went and however they lived, carried those voices with them for the rest of their lives. In dreams and in waking moments, in crowds and in solitude, they heard the names being called, heard the sound of boots crunching in snow, heard the creak of branches under weight that should not be there. Some of them drank to silence the voices. Some of them moved constantly to outrun them. Some of them retreated into silence of their own, building walls of refusal around the memories, but the voices always found them, patient and persistent, because the forest had marked them and did not forget. And what the forest marks it keeps in a way that distance cannot erase. Thomas Farrow, in the last year of his life, spoke once more of the expedition, telling his sister in a moment of unguarded honesty that the worst part was not what had happened to the others but the knowledge that he and the other survivors had been allowed to leave, that the forest could have kept them all but chose not to, and that the choosing implied intention, and intention implied intelligence, and intelligence implied something watching and deciding, and the idea of being seen and measured and found temporarily unworthy of keeping was more terrifying than any monster he could have imagined. He died 3 days later in his sleep, and his sister found him with his eyes open and his hands clutched around the bedsheets as if he had been holding on to something that had tried to pull him away. Gideon Marsh lived longer than the others, making it to the age of 71 before a stroke took him in a boarding house in Santa Fe. And in his final days, when the fever made him delirious, he spoke of the forest and the camp and the thing that had followed them, and the nurses who attended him wrote in their notes that he seemed to be arguing with someone they could not see, telling them he had kept his promise. He had stayed away. He had told no one the full truth, and pleading to be left alone. And when he finally died, his face held an expression of relief so profound that the undertaker remarked on it and said he had never seen a dead man look so grateful. The forest keeps its secrets, and the men it took are part of those secrets now, woven into the roots and the snow and the silence that fills the spaces between trees. Their names are forgotten by all but a few scholars who dig through old records and wonder about the gaps, about the expeditions that failed and the men who vanished and the reports that were filed and then quietly buried. The truth is there, in fragments, in journal entries and territorial logs, and the fading memories of a generation that is mostly gone, but the truth is incomplete, and will remain so because some questions are not meant to be answered, and some doors are not meant to be opened. And in the north, in the mountains where the snow falls heavy and the trees grow old, there is still a creek that runs dark over stones, and a clearing that is not quite a clearing anymore, and a presence that waits with the patience of something that has all the time in the world, because the wilderness is not empty and never was, and the men who forgot that paid a price that their bodies could not afford and their minds could not process. And the forest accepted the payment and waits for the next men who will be foolish or desperate or arrogant enough to believe that axes and rifles and human will are sufficient currency to buy safe passage through a place that has never recognized human authority and never will. October 31st, 1903, northern Montana. The trees had grown taller in the 20 years since men last built fires in the clearing at Blackwater Creek, their trunks thick with age and their branches forming a canopy so dense that even autumn sun struggled to reach the forest floor, and the undergrowth had reclaimed what axes had once cleared, filling the spaces with ferns and brambles and the quiet persistence of wilderness that does not forget intrusion but simply waits for time to erase the evidence. The cabins that had stood in a rough circle were now nothing more than collapsed piles of rotted timber, their roofs caved in under 2 decades of snow, their walls dissolved into the earth like sugar in water, and the only indication that men had once lived here was the occasional glint of metal, a nail, a hinge, a tin cup, half buried in soil, that had covered them with the patience of a grave that knows it has eternity to complete its work. A young surveyor named Daniel Whitmore stood at the edge of what had been the clearing, his transit and measuring chains forgotten at his feet, his notebook open but empty of the notes he was supposed to be taking because the place had stolen his attention the moment he emerged from the tree line and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in the span of a single step. He was 26 years old, educated at a technical college in Chicago, trained to see the world as measurements and bearings and elevations that could be recorded and mapped and rendered into neat lines on paper, but standing here in this place that his instruments said was just another clearing and just another forest, he felt something his education had not prepared him for, a viscosity in the air, a thickness that made breathing feel like work and looking feel like trespassing. His crew, 3 men who had worked surveys across Montana and Wyoming, and who treated wilderness with the casual disrespect of those who had spent years reducing it to numbers, stood behind him at the tree line and refused to enter the clearing. The oldest of them, a chainman named Otis Grange who had survived blizzards and bear attacks and falls that should have killed him, said he would wait at the edge and that Whitmore could go in alone if he wanted, but that nothing short of doubled wages would get Otis to set foot in that place. And when Whitmore asked why, Otis said it felt wrong, and that wrong was reason enough for any man who wanted to keep all his parts attached and functional. The other 2 crew members nodded agreement, their faces showing an unease they could not articulate, but which their bodies recognized the way animals recognize the scent of predator. Whitmore had heard the stories, of course, because anyone working in the Northern Territories heard them eventually, whispered over campfires and muttered in surveyor camps and trading posts. The tale of the expedition that went into the woods and did not come out, or came out incomplete, depending on which version reached which ear. He had dismissed the stories as frontier mythology, the kind of exaggerated nonsense that uneducated men tell each other to make their work seem more dangerous and therefore more worthy of respect. And he had said as much to his crew when they first approached this area, and the men began to grow nervous. But standing here now, feeling the wrongness that Otis had named but could not define, Whitmore found his certainty cracking like ice under weight. He walked into the clearing because his pride demanded it, and because walking away would mean admitting that a place could have power over a rational mind, and his boots crunched through dead leaves and broken wood, and the sound seemed to carry farther than it should, echoing off trees that stood too still and too silent. The collapsed cabins were scattered like broken toys, their timbers gray and soft with rot, and poking through the debris were objects that told fragments of stories: a rusted axe head, a boot with the leather gone brittle, a tin plate bent and corroded, and half buried near what must have been the mess hall, a journal wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from 2 decades of weather. Whitmore picked up the journal with hands that trembled slightly, though he told himself the trembling was from cold and not from the growing certainty that he should not be here, and he opened it carefully. The pages stuck together in places and brittle in others, and the handwriting inside was cramped and hurried. The ink faded to brown but still legible. The first entries were mundane, logs of work completed and supplies consumed, written in the neat hand of someone who believed documentation was important, but as the pages progressed, the handwriting deteriorated, the lines slanting and overlapping, and the content shifted from factual to frantic, from observation to pleading, from record-keeping to something that looked like prayer or madness or both. The final entries made Whitmore's breath catch in his throat, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. The writer describing men vanishing, gear left behind, something in the woods that watched and waited and took. And the last line, written in a hand that shook so badly the letters were barely formed, read, "We are 9 now, and we are leaving at first light. May God forgive us for what we are leaving behind." Below that, in different ink and different handwriting, was a single sentence added later, the letters carefully formed and deeply pressed, "But we never left." Whitmore looked up from the journal and realized the light had changed. The afternoon sun replaced by a dimness that had no source, as if the clearing had filled with shadow that came from the ground rather than the sky, and the temperature had dropped further, cold enough now that his breath hung in the air in thick clouds, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing except the sound of his own heart beating too fast and too loud. He turned to look back at the tree line where his crew waited, and they were still there, but they seemed farther away than they should be, as if the clearing had grown while he was not paying attention, and when he called out to them, his voice sounded flat and small, swallowed by the silence before it could reach them. He started walking back toward the tree line, moving quickly but not running, because running would be admitting fear, and he was not ready to admit that yet, and the ground under his feet felt wrong, too soft in places and too hard in others. And twice he stumbled over obstacles he could not see, and when he looked down, there was nothing there, just leaf litter and rotted wood and the faint shapes of things that might have been footprints or might have been shadows. The distance to the tree line did not decrease as he walked, and panic began to rise in his chest like water filling a well, and he walked faster, his breath coming in gasps now. The journal clutched in one hand and his other hand reaching toward his crew, who were shouting something he could not hear through the silence that pressed against his ears like wool. And then he was at the tree line, stumbling through the last few feet and nearly falling into Otis's arms, and the cold lifted instantly, replaced by ordinary autumn chill, and the silence broke like a dam, flooding back with the sound of wind and distant birds and the crew's voices loud and close and asking if he was all right. Whitmore nodded because he could not speak, his throat closed and his hands shaking badly now, and Otis took the journal from him and opened it and read the final entries, and his face went pale, and he closed the journal and handed it back and said they were leaving now, immediately, and that this area would be marked on their survey as inaccessible terrain and no one would question it because no one wanted to survey places that felt like this. They packed their equipment in silence and walked south without looking back, moving fast through forest that suddenly felt too close and too aware, and they did not stop until they reached their base camp 5 miles away, and even there, with a fire burning and coffee boiling and the familiar sounds of camp life around them, Whitmore could not shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the clearing had marked him the way a predator marks prey it intends to return to, and that night he did not sleep. He only sat by the fire and watched the darkness beyond the light and wondered what the forest remembered, and whether memory in a place like that was the same as hunger. The journal, which should have been turned over to authorities or archived or studied, was instead burned the next morning. Otis did it without asking permission, throwing it into the fire while Whitmore watched, and the pages curled and blackened and released smoke that smelled wrong, acrid and sweet and faintly metallic, and the smoke rose in a column that did not disperse but climbed straight up into the sky as if seeking something. And when the last page had burned, Otis said there were things that should not be remembered, and that ink and paper were just another way for the past to reach into the present and pull. And Whitmore did not argue, because he understood that some truths are dangerous and some records are better destroyed. The survey of the Northern Territories was completed 6 weeks later, with a notable gap in the maps, a section marked unsuitable for development with no further explanation, and the official report cited difficult terrain and resource limitations, and recommended that future surveys avoid the area. And the recommendations were accepted without question. because by 1903 there were easier places to map and better resources to exploit, and no one wanted to waste time and money on a section of forest that yielded nothing but unease. The maps were filed, the reports were archived, and the area around Blackwater Creek became a blank space, terra incognita, a hole in the official record where knowledge should have been, but where instead there was only a notation that meant stay away without saying why. Whitmore finished his surveying career and moved to Denver, where he worked in an office drawing maps from other people's field notes, never returning to the wilderness, never speaking of what he had felt in that clearing except once, late in life, to a grandson who wanted to hear stories about the frontier. He told the boy that the wilderness was not empty and had never been empty, that there were places where the rules that govern the world grew thin and something else pressed through, and that men who ignored this truth did so at their peril. The grandson, who was young and modern and believed in science and progress and the supremacy of human understanding, smiled politely and did not ask questions, and Whitmore did not offer more because he knew that some knowledge cannot be taught, only learned through experience, and he would not wish that education on anyone. The forest at Blackwater Creek continued its patient work, covering the last traces of the camp, dissolving metal into rust and wood into soil and stone into smaller stones, erasing the evidence of human presence the way water erases footprints in sand. The clearing grew smaller as saplings filled it, young trees rising through the remains of the cabins, their roots wrapping around the bones of the structures and pulling them down into earth. And within another decade, the clearing was gone entirely, replaced by forests that looked as if it had never been disturbed, as if men had never built fires there, or set traps or died in numbers that made the survivors refuse to speak. But the presence remained. The thing that had been there before the men arrived and was still there after they left or were taken. The intelligence that existed in the spaces between trees and beneath snow, and in the silence that fills the wilderness when all other sounds have fled. It was not malevolent in the way humans understand malevolence, because malevolence requires intent, and intent requires caring, and this presence did not care about humans any more than a river cares about the stones it wears smooth. It simply was, occupying space and time in ways that human perception could not fully grasp, and when humans entered that space, the presence noticed them the way a hand notices a splinter, with the same instinct to remove the irritation, and the removal was absolute and final, and left no trace except in the minds of those who witnessed it and survived to carry the memory like a scar. Over the decades that followed, the area remained largely untouched. A few trappers attempted to work the region, and either left quickly or did not leave at all, their fates unknown and uninvestigated because by the early 20th century, there were fewer trappers and more regulations, and the fur trade that had built fortunes was dying under the weight of fashion changes and conservation laws. A few hikers in the 1920s reported feeling uneasy in certain areas and finding places where their compasses spun uselessly and where the forest seemed to press in too close. But these reports were dismissed as the complaints of city dwellers unused to wilderness, and no serious attention was paid. A logging company considered the area in 1935, but withdrew their claim after 3 surveyors quit in a single week, each citing personal reasons that did not match, but which all boiled down to the same sentiment. The woods were wrong, and no amount of money was worth working in them. The forests of northern Montana kept their secrets, and Blackwater Creek remained one of many places where the official maps showed contours and elevations, but where the true geography was something else entirely. A landscape of thresholds and boundaries that could not be measured with instruments, but only felt with senses that evolution had tried to breed out of humans and had not quite succeeded. The men who vanished in 1883 became part of that landscape, absorbed into it the way water absorbs into dry ground, and whether they existed in any meaningful way after their vanishing was a question that had no answer, and no one left alive who wanted to ask it. The 9 survivors who had walked out of the forest carried the weight of their survival until death released them from it, each man knowing that he had been marked and measured and found wanting or perhaps found surplus to requirements, and that the forest could have kept them all but had chosen to send them back as messengers or warnings, or simply as a reminder that human presence in certain places is tolerated, only at the discretion of things humans do not control and cannot comprehend. They died at different times in different places, but they all died with the same look in their eyes, a distance, a watching, as if they were seeing through the present moment to something beyond it, and their final words, when they spoke any, were variations on the same theme. The forest remembers. The forest is patient. The forest is still there. And it is still there, deep in the northern mountains where the snow falls heavy and the trees grow old, and the silence is so complete that even the wind seems reluctant to break it. The creek still runs, its water dark and cold, cutting through stone that has stood since the ice retreated and will stand long after the last human has forgotten this story, or any story. The clearing is forest now, indistinguishable from the thousands of acres around it, marked on no map, visited by no one, a place that exists in physical space but occupies a different kind of territory in the collective memory of those who know the stories. A cautionary tale about hubris and wilderness and the limits of human dominion over a world that was never made for humans and never agreed to be claimed by them. On certain nights, when conditions are right and the veil between what is and what was grows thin, there are sounds that carry from that place, faint and distant but clear enough to be heard by those who listen, sounds that might be wind through branches or water over stone, but which sound instead like voices calling names. 20 names repeated in an endless loop, as if the forest is counting its collection and confirming that all pieces are accounted for and properly stored. And deep in the trees, where light fails and human eyes cannot follow, there are shapes that move with wrong rhythms and wrong gaits, shadows that are darker than surrounding dark, presences that watch with attention that feels like weight. The forest remembers everything, forgets nothing, and waits with a patience measured in centuries rather than seasons, and what it took in 1883 it keeps still, and what it marked then it watches still, and the story of the 27 trappers who entered its domain is not a story with an ending, but a story that pauses, waiting for the next chapter that will be written when the next group of men or women decide they are immune to warnings and immune to history and immune to the simple truth that some places do not belong to anyone and never will. The land endures, the forest endures, the presence endures. And somewhere in the archives of territorial records and the fading memories of a few scholars and the nightmares of descendants who inherited fear they cannot name, the story endures too, incomplete and unsatisfying and unresolved, because some stories are not meant to have endings, only continuations, and the continuation happens in the dark spaces of the northern woods where men once built a camp and believed they were conquering wilderness when in fact they were only visiting on borrowed time, and the forest, patient and eternal, simply waited for the loan to come due and collected its payment in flesh and fear, and the spaces where men used to be.